Today, senators will be hearing opening arguments in the second day of former President Donald Trump's historic second impeachment trial. This comes after Mr. Trump's attorneys lost their bid to halt the proceedings on constitutional grounds. Democrats argue not holding the former president accountable for inciting riots at the Capitol on January 6th would render the impeachment process as meaningless. So to break it all down and what we heard yesterday, let's bring in CBS News legal expert and analyst Rikki Klieman to join us. Rikki, I'm really glad you're here. I bet you this is your thing, right? Watching it unfold yesterday, I'm sure you were getting super excited. So I'm really happy to have you here watching them present their arguments. Yesterday, House impeachment managers opened the trial by showing a grim compilation of footage from the events on January 6th. Day one of the trial focused on whether or not the Constitution gives the Senate jurisdiction to try a former official. Not really, they didn't argue the merits of whether or not the former president, was guilty. Why do you think it was really important to start with this argument, for Democrats to lay out this video timeline during the first hour of the first day, seeing as it was a constitutional argument that was the focus, but they started with this timeline?
To make a first impression. I have taught for decades around the country the art of opening statements. And the opening statement can cause a prospective juror to make up his or her mind. And after that point, it is very difficult for that juror to change their mind. So even though this was supposed to be an argument about the law, the constitutionality of this procedure, that what the House managers did was not only smart, I think I would say it was brilliant, that 13-minute video clip, which did in real time give us the violence, the terror of the insurrection at the Capitol, coupled with simultaneous utterances, statements, tweets from Donald Trump, it was chilling beyond belief. I think that it's a month ago, and even though it was horrendous when we watched it, and terrifying when we watched it a month ago, to bring it back and lead off with that 13-minute video made, I would think, everyone, certainly me, relive it all again.
You know, I texted Anne-Marie while we were watching this, Rikki, because we were off the air, but we were obviously following the developments on television. And, I remember texting you, Anne-Marie, and saying, I'm really surprised to learn, you guys know I love history. I was really surprised as Congressman Raskin and some of the others talked about some of the precedent that they were basing their impeachment motion, the trial, on, including the impeachment of former officials who had left office, who had been removed from office, including a United States senator, and how they felt about it. And John Adams, I don't recall the quote exactly, but they put it up on the screen, John Adams saying that, for something that he did, if he was in office, he would allow himself to be impeached to the very end of his life. In other words, long after he left office, if there was something that he did that constituted a high crime or misdemeanor. So and I remember saying to you, Anne-Marie, well, this is kind of surprising in that the framers clearly thought about this, and they had no basis for the notion that an official would be charged while still in office, because all of their history were for people who had been kicked out of office.
Yeah. If you look back at the legislative history, if you look back going to the constitutional history, that is when the founding fathers were debating this whole issue and these clauses in the Constitution, you can see that, of course, just as you say, that what the founding fathers were doing was looking at removing, that is, voting for a conviction and removal of a former official. We usually look at the Republicans as the people who talk about being a conservative, that is, being someone who interprets the Constitution as an originalist, as a textualist. We heard a lot about that in the confirmation hearings of Amy Coney Barrett. And here what you had was the House managers going back to the exact words of the Constitution, the history behind it, and then citing legislative precedent, which showed, of course, that by the vast majority of legal scholars, they agree that you can remove someone who has already left office. And what that comes down to in plain English, is what Jamie Raskin argued so beautifully. There is no such thing as a January exception. That is, that you could do something absolutely outrageous. You could get in touch with another country, and you could become a pal with that other country and say, come on into the United States and invade our country so that I can still be president. Well, obviously, you can't do that in January any more than you could do it in the first 3 years and 11 months of your presidency. So going back to the original text, the history, the precedents, that's something we always associate with conservatives. We don't associate it with the Democratic Party, and particularly with liberal Democrats. It was quite an interesting turnabout.
Let me just really quickly, let me just really quickly, Anne-Marie, add what that quote was from President John Adams. This was when they were debating whether or not to impeach Daniel Webster. And here's what President Adams wrote as far as the impeachability of someone who has since left office. He wrote this, I quote, "I hold myself so long as I have the breath of life in my body amenable to impeachment by the House for everything I did during the time I held public office." So for those, as you point out, Rikki, those members of Congress and the United States Senate who always talk about the Constitution and what it means and being originalist and what the framers' intent was, well, there you have one of the framers of the Constitution and a former president of the United States saying to the very end of his life, if he committed something that was impeachable during his time in office, then he should be impeached. Sorry, Anne-Marie.
No, well, you know what, you sort of kind of presented the argument on the other side, Rikki.
The Congress and resign right after you've been impeached, but before you've been convicted. I mean, that would be preposterous.
But that was a little bit, Vlad and Rikki, kind of part of the argument on the president's side that, well, how far does it go back? You know, I mean, if you've left office 4 or 5 years ago, now we can sort of draw you back and impeach you. That was part of the argument. But kind of once the dust settled, you know, a number of Republicans sort of agreed that the Trump's attorneys did not do a very good job. They were unimpressed. It was a much stronger argument on the other side. That being said, the overwhelming majority of Republicans voted that this was not within their jurisdiction. This was not constitutional. So, Rikki, explain to me what those Republicans understood or what they got out of the argument that they thought clearly was substandard, but somehow they agreed that it was not constitutional to move forward.
If you are wedded, Anne-Marie, to a position, and it is a political position, what obviously happened here is that it didn't matter what was said. It didn't matter that the oratory skills of the House managers were so much better than those of the Republicans' lawyers. It didn't matter that the law and the legislative history, the constitutional history was on the side of the House managers. That if you only wound up with 6, and that's all you wound up with, 6 Republicans who sided with the Democrats, with the crossover of Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, who simply said that the presentation of the House managers was excellent and the presentation of the former president's lawyers was not, and it pushed him to vote with the Democrats. What you do see is perhaps the inevitability of an acquittal at the end, because the Democrats do need 17 senators from the Republican side to vote with them. You would like to hope. I mean, I still have a heart of hearts that is optimistic. You would like to hope that somehow during the course of these arguments that some Republicans could indeed search their conscience and get off of their political position to vote. While saying that, we have not yet heard the evidence on the merits, which we are going to hear today. And there is an important factor here during the 16 hours that the House managers will have in their attempt to persuade the senators to vote for conviction. We all know about the violence, the terror, the insurrection on January 6th. We also know about the president's words on January 6th. But what the House managers must do is create a direct connection, not just of the president's words on January 6th, but a long period of time to show that he intended and directed, that there is a direct link to the then imminent violence and ultimately 5 deaths at the Capitol on January 6th. So it's that link that is critical for the House managers to prove over the next 2 days.
You know, I was struck also, Anne-Marie and Rikki, by that quote from Carl Sandburg, I believe. If the facts are against you, argue the law. If the law is against you, argue the fact. If the law and the facts are against you, pound the table and scream and yell, right? Which we kind of saw in the second presentation from the president's second lawyer, David Schoen. So I guess to further what Anne-Marie was talking about, is it because, Rikki, you talked about giving speeches on opening remarks, is it because, and they alluded to this early on, that the House impeachment manager's presentation was so powerful, was so good, that whatever they had planned to do when they went in there went out the window when they saw the House impeachment managers, and then it was very hard to sort of ad-lib your way out of this. And at the end of the day, you know, what does it matter if, you know, you've got Rand Paul doodling on a pad and others not paying attention, because at the end of the day, they're all going to vote to acquit the president anyway?
I think it does matter, Vlad. I think that what matters is that we have integrity during this process, even if the final vote is for an acquittal, that the House managers must go forth and do their very, very best, not only to attempt to change the mind of certain senators, but also to educate the American people as to precisely what happened that made for an impeachment for high crime and misdemeanor. As Jamie Raskin says, if this is not impeachable, then what is? And what you got with the former president's lawyers was an excuse. Bruce Castor, I have to say, was rambling and incoherent. I can't be any more kind than that. And to say that his rambling discourse and his folksy ways were all because the House managers were so solid, so talented, so persuasive, well, that's no excuse at all. You prepare and you plan and you go forth with your theory of the case. There is no such thing when you are defending as not having a theory of the case. You must have a theory and one theory. It is not, if no facts and no law, pound the table, which is exactly what Mr. Castor did, if you can even call it that. When he was followed by David Schoen at least made some attempt to argue the law. It just wasn't particularly persuasive, I say as an understatement, because the Republicans know it wasn't persuasive. So you can either just throw up your hands on both sides and say, well, it doesn't matter in the end, we know how everyone's going to vote. That just cannot be. You have to be able to put forth this case. This was an insurrection. This was domestic terrorism. One of the things I was thinking about when I watched the video yet again this morning was that one of the perspectives we don't have is the perspective of if those police officers had body cameras and they saw what was coming at them, the terror that those officers must have felt, that they were being overpowered by an angry mob. And we don't really get that perspective. What we get is what we saw is horrific, but I can't even imagine the recipients of that rage.
Yeah, it was a thing to behold. And, there were moments, too, in Mr. Schoen's presentation where you can clearly hear the talking points that had come from Trump world. I mean, at one point he screamed very loudly, this is an attempt to cancel. I'm paraphrasing, but this is an attempt to cancel, the president. It felt interesting, and I know that Alan He, one of our Capitol Hill reporters, reminded us all on Twitter yesterday that even Lindsey Graham earlier, when he was on perhaps Fox News or another one of the channels, made the joke that you kind of get what you pay for. We all know that the president lost his or the other lawyers that he originally had hired to defend him for the impeachment have left, and these two were really not given a lot of time to prepare. So we'll see how day two breaks out.
There's a remedy for that, Vlad.
What's that?
There's a remedy. If there's a remedy for that, if you do not have a time sufficient to prepare, you ask for a continuance. If they needed another week, they certainly could have asked for it. That did not occur.
Yeah, that's true. Although one thing we didn't really get into, and we don't have time now, but it's important also to note that part of the argument was, well, he's left office. And we talked about this earlier this week, right? When Mitch McConnell was the Senate Majority Leader, he could have had this impeachment trial before President Trump left office. They were able to get a Supreme Court justice, to the bench very, very quickly, but they chose not to do it. So it's like, well, you can't impeach him because he's no longer in office. But no, we couldn't do it when he was in office because there was no time. I mean, it's sort of like you can't really win either way if you're the Democrats who were at the time not in control of the Senate. Really interesting breakdown and analysis as always, Rikki. I wish you were here on set with us. I wish Anne Marie was here. I wish we were all back to normal and we could spend, hours and hours talking about this in anticipation of the trial starting again later this afternoon. But we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, Rikki.
Thank you.